Story 1. A few years ago, I was hired for a job in a big city where rent was expensive. I slept on my brother's couch for a few months while I struggled to find a place. Eventually, I found someone in an old building who wanted to get out of their rental agreement. The apartment was close to work and in a nice area, so I took it. It almost seemed too good to be true. It didn't take long for me to realize I had made a big mistake. The building was old, and the walls were made of plaster. Any sound reverberated like crazy. I could hear people cough and sneeze as if they were right in my place. What's worse, I shared one of these thin walls with my neighbors, who were absolutely unbearable. They just would not be quiet. I constantly heard a man and a woman arguing, often until 2 or 3 in the morning. By arguing, I mean literally screaming, shouting, and throwing things against the wall. When they weren't arguing, they were always just loud, shouting and whining at each other like little kids. They were the quintessential toxic, obnoxious couple, and the things they argued about were so trivial. I remember hearing an argument about whose turn it was to steal shampoo from the drugstore. One time, the boyfriend decided to yell, "The Bible says what the Bible says," over and over again for some reason. Almost every day, it would be something different and uniquely annoying. The first real incident happened when I was woken up by screaming and banging against my wall at 1 a.m. I did what I usually did, blasted Kenny G through my speakers at the wall until they shut up, but this time, it didn't work. The banging got louder, so I stopped the music, but then it got worse and sounded like a fight. It was hard to describe, but it sounded like the woman was being beaten up. At this point, I was more concerned than angry, so I called my superintendent, who told me to call the police not in the United States. The police came, the neighbors told them everything was fine, the police left, and it was quiet. I went back to bed. Literally the next night, I was woken up again at 1 a.m. by my neighbors having another argument. This time, I heard a loud bang, then the woman said, "Oh my God," in a weird voice, followed by banging and what sounded like someone being strangled. The noises were freaky and way more concerning than the last time, so I called the police again. The police came, the neighbors told them everything was fine again, the police left again, and it was quiet again. But this time, the police called me back and basically told me I was wasting their time. They said there was no evidence of any fight, and both neighbors denied anything had happened. Even the superintendent said that no one else on the floor complained and hinted that I was starting to become a nuisance. From this point forward, I decided to document everything with video evidence. The noise continued for the next 6 months, and I would get woken up at least once a week after midnight by yelling and screaming. I made a few written complaints, recorded some videos as evidence, and sent them to the property manager. There was enough to serve the neighbors an eviction notice and go to the landlord-tenant board, but somehow the property manager messed up the date for the hearing, and it never actually took place. Thankfully, the noise stopped anyway for now, so I assumed the neighbors had finally gotten the message and would be quiet from now on. I didn't push for another hearing because the eviction notice gave the neighbors an opportunity to be quiet, which they somewhat did. As an aside, the video evidence I gathered during this time was excellent. I was pleasantly surprised that my phone was very good at picking up their voices. It got to the point where I would get excited when I was woken up in the middle of the night because I would run out into the hallway and film their door and room number as the noise blasted out and echoed down the hall. I gathered some damning, unambiguous evidence, pure gold, and it was all time-stamped around midnight or 1 a.m., but because the hearing got cancelled, I didn't get to present my evidence, at least not yet. For a few months, everything was reasonably okay. They were still loud as ever during the day, and there were a few times after 11 p.m. on weeknights when I went to their door and asked them to keep it down. But other than that, things were mostly better, and I was starting to be able to relax in my place for once. Yet again, it was too good to be true. One day around 2:30 in the afternoon, I started hearing this weird, high-pitched screeching coming from my neighbor's place, and it didn't stop for hours. I was sitting on my couch trying to figure out what it was. It sounded like a giant tropical bird had moved in next door. Well, it turns out that after all the trouble we went through a year ago with the noise complaints and eviction notice, my neighbors decided it would be a good idea to get a dog. And of course, these obnoxious people couldn't just get a quiet, well-behaved dog. They had to get a completely untrained, 4-month-old, tiny, yappy Pomeranian that was incapable of being quiet. This dog would yap, screech, and bark over and over every day for hours. While I was still coming to terms with how miserable my life was about to become, I got a note under my door. On it, my neighbor wrote that she had just gotten the dog as an emotional support animal for her mental health and asked the whole hallway to please try to tolerate the noise. I was already living next to and listening to these neighbors scream at each other for over a year. They were confirmed troublemakers, too insane, toxic individuals in a mutually abusive relationship. I knew with certainty that they weren't capable of taking proper care of this dog, and the noise situation would escalate into complete chaos. Regarding my mental health, I was going through my own troubles during this time in part due to lack of sleep and was seeing a therapist. The last year of complaints should have made it clear to anyone that noise was a problem for me, especially getting woken up at night. Of all the things this neighbor could have chosen to help her mental health, she chose the most obnoxious option possible. She knew getting a loud dog would be a problem and did it anyway. It was time for action. I realized that if I wanted this noise to stop or to be taken seriously, I needed a mountain of evidence against my neighbors. I researched the eviction process and everything that was required. I checked the forms my superintendent would have to send out for an eviction notice. I read threads on online forums about landlords and neighbor disputes. It became clear to me that the only way to win was to be religiously disciplined in both gathering evidence and refusing to retaliate no more. Kenny G. I became a noise complaint monk, taking a vow of disciplined log-taking and relying on mantras like, "Be quiet, be quiet." Once I submitted my first written complaint, things got bad. My neighbors flipped out when they realized I was complaining again. I heard things like, "Of all the apartments, we have to live next to this guy?" for a few days. Then the loud arguments in the middle of the night started all over again. And one of the neighbors got into the new habit of slamming their chest of drawers against my wall at 2 a.m. The barking also got much worse. The emotional support animal letter said that the barking would improve once the dog was trained. But from what I could hear, my neighbors' methods of training began and ended with screaming at the dog just like they screamed at each other every day. "No, bad dog, be quiet. Shut up," came through my wall in new and varied combinations every day. And every time an argument started between my neighbors, the dog would always join in, even in the middle of the night. The constant level of noise was overwhelming. For over a year, I logged every instance of yelling, shouting, and barking coming from my neighbor's apartment. It didn't matter if it was after 11 p.m. or not at this point. I was trying to demonstrate that I couldn't get peace at any time of day. And when I say every instance, I mean I had minute-to-minute logs of every loud noise and every word I heard through my neighbor's wall. If I was woken up in the middle of the night, it went in the log. If I heard the dog bark from noon to 1 p.m. on February 2nd, it went in the log. If I heard someone yell, "You peed on the floor again, darn," at the dog, it went in the log. Honestly, it was exhausting and made me almost lose my mind. But by the time I was done, I had pages and pages of notes. Obviously, written logs wouldn't be enough. I already had a decently large stack of video evidence to demonstrate the true character of my neighbors. But I needed current evidence if there was going to be another hearing. Forget Spielberg, now I was like Coppola in the heart of darkness. I got more videos of screaming and shouting coming out of their door. I got videos of banging and barking against my shared wall. I got videos of screaming, shouting, banging, and barking all at the same time, or in any combination. I had amassed a war chest of video evidence to be deployed at the next available hearing, but I was getting war weary. At this point, I was about 6 or 8 months into the complaints process, and I could barely take it anymore. I was getting woken up like 2 nights a week and would be a zombie at work. I often complained about my neighbors at work. I was finding it harder and harder to keep myself from blasting music, banging on their wall, or kicking their door down. But I managed to stay strong, and I followed the eviction process like it was my religion. I sent in a second written complaint, then a third, which resulted in an eviction notice that gave the neighbors an opportunity to be quiet. This time, they didn't care. In fact, they were louder than ever before. I was looking for other places to move into when I finally got good news from the property manager. There's a hearing date. There was light at the end of the tunnel, but once the neighbors heard about the hearing date, they did everything they could to mess things up for me. There were no attempts to stop the barking anymore. It was constant. The screaming matches were back in full force, and when they started yelling and screaming, the dog would go wild. It was just an insane amount of noise. And the drawers were ridiculous. Honestly, I never expected the slamming drawers to be that bad, but they easily surpassed the barking and the shouting. They would slam and slam and slam the drawers over and over again against my wall, and because of the plaster, it would boom, 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 and echo through my whole place. These people were definitely doing it on purpose. 3 days before the hearing date, I went to bed at 9:45 p.m. At 10 p.m., I was still not asleep, but was startled by the boom, boom of the drawers. I logged it and went back to bed. At 11:30 p.m., I woke up to boom, boom, boom again, and I was furious. It took me half an hour, but I fell asleep again. Then, at 12:45 a.m., boom, 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 there it was again. I called my superintendent, told her what was going on, and she called them to tell them to stop. I fell back asleep. Then at 1:30 a.m., boom, boom, boom. I woke up super angry. It was obvious they were doing this on purpose to upset me before the hearing and get a reaction out of me. I called the superintendent again and went back to sleep. Then at 2:45 a.m., boom, boom, boom. I couldn't take it anymore. I screamed, "Do it again! Do it again!" I lost it. I couldn't help myself. My discipline broke. My superintendent called me and told me my neighbors had just claimed I yelled a death threat through the wall, what the heck, and that they were calling the police, what the heck. Everything just felt messed up now. I couldn't sleep, so I just waited until morning. No police showed up, and I went to work. I realized I couldn't even stay at my place anymore until this hearing was over, so I went back to my brother's couch for the next 3 days. Finally, the big day arrived. I gathered my evidence. Over a year of meticulously logged noise complaints, 6 instances of video evidence, I cherry-picked the gold out of 20 good ones. The previous eviction notice the neighbors received, 4 written noise complaints including the 2 from the previous eviction notice, a letter from my co-worker about poor work performance due to lack of sleep, and even a letter from my therapist about how my neighbor's excessive noise was affecting my mental health. I got there and met the property manager and superintendent, who were there with the owner of the property management company and a slick-looking lawyer. I handed the lawyer all my evidence. I gave him a USB stick with the videos. I even handed over my big Bluetooth speaker to make sure the videos were loud enough to hear. Laptop speakers are awful. I looked over to my neighbors, and they were wide-eyed. They looked scared. Finally, we all went into the landlord-tenant boardroom with everybody. The adjudicator first asked if anyone wanted to mediate instead of going through with the hearing. My neighbor's hand immediately shot up. I said in front of everybody, "I don't want to mediate." But apparently, it wasn't up to me, and the lawyer took me aside. The lawyer told me that if it went to mediation, the neighbors and the property management would create an agreement, for example, no more noise at a certain time, and if that agreement was broken once, it would result in an immediate eviction. He explained that if we went in front of the board instead, it was a 50-50 chance they either got evicted or got off completely. Obviously, mediation was the better way to go. I knew these individuals were already incapable of keeping quiet, so I agreed with the lawyer. We went out to find the neighbors, and they were nowhere to be found. It turns out they opted for free legal counsel. I wonder why, and wouldn't be available until the afternoon. While waiting, I explained to the property manager, owner, and lawyer what had happened a few days ago with the slamming drawers all night long. When I made my complaints before, no one really took them seriously, but today, everyone was very interested in everything I had to say. The afternoon came, and I was excluded from the mediation meeting because it was between the neighbors, the lawyer, and the owner. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could hear my neighbors yelling and shouting from inside the room, so I knew it wasn't going well for them. Everyone left the room, and the lawyer came up to me. He told me the mediation failed. The neighbors refused to change their behavior and wouldn't accept any terms. The lawyer said they would have to go in front of the adjudicator again, but by now, it was almost the end of the day. I waited another hour or two, and everyone came out. I saw my neighbors leave as the lawyer approached me again and explained. Apparently, after the mediation failed, the property management owner offered my neighbors 2 months rent-free if they agreed to move out in 2 months. The neighbors agreed, but when they all went in front of the adjudicator, the neighbors changed their minds and said no. And apparently, a second offer was made, which they said yes to, and then no again, all in front of the adjudicator. They ended up running out of time, and the adjudicator cut the hearing short and said it would have to be resolved in a second hearing. I was disappointed, but the lawyer assured me that because of how capricious and irrational my neighbors behaved during the hearing, they would almost certainly be evicted during a second hearing. I was dismayed that it wasn't over, but I was hopeful the end was coming soon. I also felt vindicated. It was finally clear to everyone that my neighbors were actually irrational, and I wasn't just making this up. The next 2 months weren't as bad as before. I continued my long, steady march of logs and videos. But the noise definitely let up, especially the drawers. One day near the end of the second month, I started to hear insane barking that wouldn't stop. It went on for hours and hours. I called the superintendent to complain, and they told me it was probably because the neighbors were moving out today. Yes, finally. Apparently, she couldn't tell me earlier because of privacy reasons. As they were moving out, I blasted, "Nah nah hey hey kiss him goodbye" on loop, put in some earplugs, and took a 2-hour bath. My apartment is quiet now, and I can finally sleep. It wasn't exactly the satisfying crushing blow I wanted, but my discipline paid off, and now I can live in peace.